Hello everyone and welcome to my new Topical Ramble video. In this video I wanted to discuss the importance of our gaming legacy. When you think about it, there's been so many games that have been lost to the mists of time. I know recently we've seen an upsurge in terms of reissuing old games and retro games collections, whether it's via software or whether he's buying retro hardware. The new Super Nintendo Mini, the Nintendo Mini, there's a Commodore 64 collection that's going to come out, which has a mini little Commodore 64. All that stuff is great, but think about it for a minute. That only is representative of a really minute portion of games that actually came out on that system at the time. I know certainly the Commodore 64 one, there are probably tens of thousands of games that will never see light of day again. It's just simply because of the fact that the licensing issue with those games is up in the air. Some companies do have the license, they just don't want to do anything with those games. Others, it's impossible to actually trace who officially owns the license. You know, and if a software house was bought by another, then bought by another, then bought by another, and then that just disappeared, then there becomes an issue of over who actually has license for these games. In many cases the source code of the games can't be found, although there might be copies of games out there that people can play. It's just impossible to get any of this cleared, and it really is kind of frustrating because although we do know there have been television shows and movies that have been lost to time, it's been by no means on as large a scale as it has with regard to video games. Even now you can go and buy Blu-rays of films that are like nearly 100 years old that have been continuously reissued and reissued down the years on different formats. But it's very much harder to find games that have been reissued that was, say, on a Commodore VIC-20. You try finding games that have been reissued that were VIC-20 games, that you wouldn't have to first of all have the 35 or so year old hardware and a cassette or cartridge from that period and hope that it still works. That's the only way you can get to play those games officially. Now, there are always the other avenue of going down the pathway of emulation, which there's a reason I want to sort of play emulation down for the time being. And the reason behind that is it's not, strictly speaking, a legitimate channel. Now, the legalities of it are quite questionable. You know, quote unquote, I think the official line is if you own the game, then if you own the actual game, then owning the emulated piece of software is supposedly legal. I'm not 100% sure on how correct that is. I'm not 100% sure on how that works. But I think it's kind of nebulous, and let's face it, nobody's taking any notice of that. And it's sad to a certain extent, because what you're essentially doing is, I'm not going to say piratism because it's always going to be a very emotive topic. I mean, I've watched people who've been playing games on a live stream just getting involved into this discussion about what people call abandonware. I'm not a big fan of that phrase either. I don't believe in abandonware in the same way that some other people might do. To me, abandonware is when a piece of software is released on a device and is no longer supported. You see this often with mobile games where they just don't get supported, and then the firmware of the device is updated and the game will no longer work because the company's not supporting it anymore. So essentially the game has been abandoned. Some people liken it to a game that was released years ago and is unavailable on the market. No, that to me isn't abandonware. It's not. A game hasn't been abandoned. The game was released as a commercially viable product, and if you still have that hardware and you still have the disc or cartridge or cassette or whatever, it works, or should work. That's not a product that's been abandoned. Quite often games get locked up in the licensing issues. We've seen a fantastic game like No One Lives Forever 1 and 2, a brilliant PC game that came out, was programmed by Monolith, who did Fear and these days are doing the Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War games. That game is locked up in a license issue, and consequently, although there is quite a big demand for people to see this game be re-released, I mean, I would love to see it re-released, the two of them remastered and re-released on PC and console, the likelihood of that happening in the near future is remote. Now, there are certain people who will take that as an indicator to go and then download an illegal copy of the game because they say, well, it's been abandoned. No, it's not. The license is in dispute. That's why. I mean, if you have the disc, you can play the game. It's as simple as that. This, again, you know, it's this issue that there is no official curation of video games. There is no official archive. Nobody is really looking after it, and it's the big Achilles heel that I see with the games industry, where the movie industry tends to curate its movies a lot more. The books tend to be curated a lot better than video games. And although comparatively speaking, obviously, video games do tend to be a new thing in comparison, it's worth reminding that it also isn't taking the experiences from previous forms of entertainment. And that is what kind of saddens me. Now, there are a lot of reasons as to why this happens. I'm not being willfully ignorant of the fact that technology moves at a far more rapid rate with video games, and consequently what you tend to see is for example, 8-bit computers from the 1980s, like the VIC-20, Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, Amstrad, computers like that, there is just no support for them on modern devices because they were so radically different. Things have changed in a much more radical way. But the software itself could have been salvaged, and there are interesting examples of how it could be done. One of the best retro collections that I've ever played, I'm just reaching up now for the disc, is actually on the Xbox One, which was a game called A Rare Replay, which has 30 games on one disc from Rare. Now, a lot of these games actually go all the way back to the ZX Spectrum when they were Ultimate Play the Game. That was the name of their software company back then. You then have NES games, you have N64 games, as well as Xbox 360 games on here, and Xbox games. It's really a fabulous collection of games, and proves that this can be done as long as the licenses are looked after. That there is an effort to preserve the license and integrity of these games, then there is always the possibility that such collections can be made available. There's games in here that are over 30 years old, and for some reason I've got the box and I'm pointing it towards my computer, but I'm not obviously recording video of that for this audio section. But it proves it can be done. And I think a lot of the problem is that previously video game companies, video game publishers, are kind of have always treated their games as a disposable asset. People talk these days more about games being sold as services and not having any permanence to them. I don't think that is a new mentality. I think it's kind of an old mentality. And I think historically speaking, video game publishers themselves don't tend to have taken what they do seriously. I don't think that they've regarded games as art necessarily, which is a surprising thing. It's almost as if they haven't placed any, what could I say, what's the right word? Probably a socially significant value on what they've done. Possibly because games started out appealing to quite a narrow band of people, and it's only really been in the last 20 years that band has kind of expanded into more of the mainstream. But even so, they haven't really taken it seriously, and it still goes on today. You look at the fact that even though Microsoft have taken steps to make the Xbox One backwardly compatible with the original Xbox and Xbox 360 games, even so there is still a comparatively minute number of games that are actually available on the Xbox One to play via backward compatibility for Xbox 360 and original Xbox games compared to those that come out. Licenses are an issue, but also the will to do it as well, the will to make the slight tweaks necessary in order to make these games run on the Xbox One seems to be something that many companies just aren't interested in. And I sat and I thought about that as well. And there are other reasons. One of the things that has always been of interest for Hollywood, for example, to curate and look after the archive of its movies more, has been the potential for them to continuously earn revenue. Every time a new format comes out and they re-release a movie on that format, it's another chance for them to earn money for that movie. So, for example, a film came out in the cinema in the 80s, then came out on VHS tape, then came out on DVD, then came out on Blu-ray, now has come out on Ultra HD 4K Blu-ray. You can see how there's always this opportunity to keep making money off the same thing. I think backward compatibility as a free service is off-putting to many of these companies, simply because it denies them the opportunity to make money again. But because they don't officially re-release the game, it then becomes a difficult thing. So when you factor the license issue and backwards compatibility not being, should we say, as economically attractive, as financially attractive to many of these software companies, because we've seen this big upswing in terms of remastered games, where they are re-releasing some classic games of previous formats and giving them a makeover. I think you can see there why there is additional complexity to why video games haven't been as curated as well and preserved as well as one would have hoped. And again, I think it all boils down to the fact that the industry suddenly, perhaps for a long time, didn't think people were interested in playing old games, and then suddenly realised, wow, actually people are interested in playing old games. There is a desire there is an enthusiasm there for playing games that were 10, 15, 20, maybe even 30 years old, and it's sort of scrambling to catch up with itself, but it doesn't really know what the best way to do it is. But I think it is important that if it's too late for many games in the past, which it would be a great shame because there's many fantastic games that I just don't ever think will see light of day again, they'll gradually fade out of public consciousness, only to be taught of by old people like myself going forward. but I think that they'll be lost on the next generation. As I say, there are exceptions. You can always point to exceptions, but that's not the rule. That's why it's called an exception. So the rule being that the larger majority of games are just going to get ended up consigned to the dustbin. Now, one of the interesting things here, and there's a reason I chose to showcase Star Wars Bounty Hunter as one of the games to show doing this, or as the game to show doing this, should I say, was because this was an interesting example of a PlayStation 2 game that was made commercially available to buy on the PlayStation 4. Now, the PlayStation 4 is kind of weird when it comes to backward compatibility. It is capable of doing it, but you can't just put the disc in. Now, apparently, there is the software within the console, within its firmware, to allow that. The PS4 OS was hacked, and people were able to unpick the fact that buried within that code is the ability to play old retro games from the disc. Which some people think, well, that's a little bit naughty of Sony to not make that available in the same way that Microsoft have, and I kind of agree with that, but I also think that it throws up this impossible situation, because a game like Star Wars Bounty Hunter, which came out on the PS2 and the original Xbox and so on, would not have seen light of day. You know, if it was just there it's backward compatible on disc, how many people would actually have bothered with it? When Sony bundled it up with a number of other Star Wars games, and they pushed that to the front of their market store and put it on special offer anytime an interesting Star Wars peaks, so when a new movie comes out, for example, it puts it back in the public eye. I mean, when I got Bounty Hunter, I also got the Pod Racer, Racer's Revenge. I got the remake of Super Star Wars, which was an old Super Nintendo game, and Jedi Starfighter, which was the sequel to Starfighter, which also came out on the PS2. So it came with a bundle of old Star Wars games, and it was great to relive these quite old games now, you know, from quite a few years ago. How many people would actually have got to do that, or been able to do that, or would have even known of the existence of these things if it was just a case of popping the disc in? So for the game publishers, for the license holders of that game, which I'm assuming is Disney, it was a way of earning revenue. So this is why I think there's many layers of complexity to backward compatibility, and as I said before, you know, being able to relive those old gaming experiences through legitimate channels, it most certainly isn't the simple cut and dried, oh, they should just make everything backward compatible. It's not practical. I think going forward is possibly easier as the technology is kind of leveled out a bit, but I mean, there was certainly issues of how would you plug a Nintendo 64 game into a Switch. You know, there's just no way of doing it. You would constantly have to be designing consoles with a degree of backward compatibility which simply wouldn't offer anything in the way of practicality, and would probably inflate the price of hardware, because you would essentially have to have multiple different versions of hardware within one console. You'd have consoles that end up looking like the Retron 5 with multiple cartridge slots in them, or multiple drives. How would you, for example, what about defunct hardware like a Commodore 64? How would you play a Commodore 64 game on a Xbox One or a PS4 when it came on magnetic tape or floppy disk? You know, and who would get to have it? It brings up those kind of issues, because hardware, there's never been one unifying piece of hardware outside of the PC. So, whereas with the format of most movies, there tends to be one clear format winner. So, down the years you've had VHS, then you had DVD, then you had Blu-ray. Although they were rivals to those formats, you've always had one overall winner that various hardware manufacturers will make their own system under license, but the movies will play across a broad range of those systems. You don't have that with consoles. What works on an Xbox One won't work on a PS4. You can't put an Xbox One game in a PS4 and vice versa. They won't work. So exclusivity is something that, again, is something that's prevalent within gaming that isn't so much, if at all, prevalent when it comes to movies. And again, it does speak of the fact that the way gaming was originally conceived and has been originally conceived, it just was never done with a viewpoint of preserving the status quo. Gaming has always been very reflective of technology and has always been about improving and pushing forward and coming out with the latest thing. And that's where the focus has always lay. It's only as time goes on will it occasionally dip back and celebrate its past. But it by no means, it's happy to do that in a passive sense rather than actively issue things out there. But things have changed, like I say, you've got the Shadow of the Colossus remaster on the PS4, you've got the Dark Souls remaster coming out on the PS4 and Xbox One that's coming up. So, but these are more remasters of more recent games. And I just wish that there had been something, maybe like an independent organisation that just was responsible for cataloguing, curating, keeping a close track on, who has license to what game. So if somebody wanted to reissue something, they would know who they would have to get permission from to do it, rather. Because I think that becomes off-putting as well. We've seen, especially on PC, you've seen companies out there, or not even companies actually, more individuals or groups of individuals that do remasters of games. That somebody, I think, actually was wanted to work on or had worked on a remaster for No One Lives Forever and couldn't get the permission to release it. But we have seen other developers actually make remasters of games and then get the permission to release those games. And the companies have brought them on board to continue making games in that series. Again, a good example of that is Shadow Warrior. Put the game up about that. It was an example of there was a game that was remastered off the original. The permission to release that game was given, and it went on to get a sequel. And that was a series that at that time nobody had bothered with for many years. You can still get the original game on Steam and GOG, but the simple fact is that somebody was able to go out there and create a remaster of that game to essentially rework that game, resurrected it and brought it back to life, brought back interest in the series. It's why I've never been against the idea of remasters, and I'll touch upon that as well. I might as well. The fact that that you get a lot of people that get upset about remastered games. They seem to think that a remastered game is going to come at the expense of a new game. That's not how it works. Believe me, it isn't. The companies will focus their resources on trying to create something new where they can. That's where they want to go with it, but remasters are a way of getting people on board who may have missed it the first time round. There was a good example of this. You have an issue of the Uncharted collection on the PlayStation, the Uncharted collection, and then you had The Last of Us remaster on the PS4. Now Sony realised that quite a few people may not have played these on the PS3. Yeah, because when the PS4 come out, it shot ahead in terms of sales. It was fairly clear to Sony that people buying the PS4 could be Xbox 360 owners, or always people who that's their first console. And they appreciated this, and they re-released the games that they thought helped define who they were in recent years, and they were very successful. Microsoft did the same with the Master Chief Collection. I'm currently working through a series of videos covering the Halo games, so they realised that as well. And some people don't like that idea. They think that, well, this means that we're not going to get new games. But there actually isn't an example of where that's happened. There isn't an example where somebody has re-released a version of a game and then made a decision based upon that re-release to say, oh, we're abandoning working on the sequel that we're making. I can't think of one specific example of that. Maybe somebody in the comment section can point that out, but I can't see where that would have been the case. Because if somebody's already making a sequel to a game, why would they abandon it because of what a remaster didn't sell particularly well? I don't think so. You know, not all remasters do sell very well. Some do, some don't. Some come out at a really good price point. For example, just looking at the LA Noire game that has been remastered and re-released for the Xbox One and PlayStation 4. It came out at a really reasonable price. And it's well worth it. It's an absolutely fantastic game. And now people can go and play that game. Because, let's face it, if a sequel to that game doesn't come about, you can be rest assured it's not because of whether a remaster of that game sold well or not. It was more than likely going to be down to the fact that the series hadn't sold fantastically well overall. Full stop. Think about it. You know, if a game series sells really well, the chances of a sequel not being made are quite kind of remote. In the case of LA Noire, there was also the issue of problems with the game developer at the time, between the game developer and the publisher. There was friction there. So, you know, there's always other reasons. There's always reasons out there as to why these things can end up falling through. But I believe strongly in remasters. I think that there is no reason why they shouldn't exist. You know, I think it was Stan Lee that said that every single comic book that's ever issued is somebody's first comic book, which is why he always liked to sort of give a kind of lowdown on the character's history in every comic book. Something that the reader, who the first time they pick up that comic book, they don't feel like it's an insurmountable task to get into that series of comic books. And the same, I look at remasters, reissues and retro games in the same way. You know, it can help people get into a series of games. Microsoft knew that Halo 5 was going to be the game that came out on the Xbox One, but they didn't want people to feel overwhelmed by the fact that the Halo 5 had a story that some people might not be able to follow. That's why there was the Master Chief Collection, so you could play right through that storyline before that game come out, if you so wanted to. It's a little bit different with video games to comic books, but you know, because video games don't release a new video game in a series every week or bi-weekly or monthly. You know, it takes quite a few years. And so the chances of stories being forgotten is greater. But it makes sense. You know, look at it that way. It's not halting the development of new games. It's just merely giving people the time to enjoy games that they may have missed previously, and they don't need to have the retro hardware in order to be able to play it. Because let's face it, computers break, consoles break. No matter how well you look after them, time is always a killer to electronic equipment, and the older the hardware, the more chance there is of it breaking down. Once you lose the ability to do that without going down non-legal channels, being able to play those old games becomes very difficult to, if not impossible. And so unless you know people that can keep doing running repairs to these things, or you yourself are so minded that you can keep doing running repairs to these devices, then at the end of the day, it's going to become more difficult to keep playing those old games. Surely, therefore, remasters take away that fear. Now, obviously, you can't do it for every game. It's not practical. But, like I say, I do think that there should be an avenue, an opportunity for just some place, and maybe there is. I mean, I'm only speaking because of the fact that I know that there's still this issue of people not knowing who owns licenses for certain games. You know, that's why I brought it up. That's why I brought up No One Lives Forever, the complexities of that license. If there was a place that all of this was stored, like a central data system or whatever, then these things wouldn't be so much of an issue. You know, there was something there like, who owns the license to this game? It's this company. Then at least you'd know who to canvass for wanting them to re-release it. And then of course you have companies like I mentioned earlier who just sit on games licenses and don't do anything with them. Electronic Arts and Activision are a couple of companies that are guilty of that. They must have a lot of licenses for games that they have that they just have mothballed. You know, EA has the likes of the Strike series of games, Road Rash, stuff like that no one else is going to be able to release an official version of those games. And EA just don't seem bothered about doing anything about it. You know, Medal of Honor being a case in point as well. You look at that and you think, well, they're not going to do anything with this, so what's the point? And there you have it. I mean, there's just so many different angles. So, I mean, I guess to sum up what I'm saying is that I really wish that the software industry would get its act together. You know, whatever system out there at the moment they may have, I don't think is good enough. And it would be nice that old games could be resurrected. They could be brought back in far simpler ways than they are already. And I'm not even going to go into the issue of movie license games and arcade conversion license games, because that just opens up a whole new kettle of fish. That opens up a whole new range of problems, because those type of licenses expire, which means that those games can't be reissued because they don't have the license to release properties that might be related to comic books, movies, so on and so forth. That's a whole different kettle of fish. And to try to go in depth with that would probably take somebody who's better at doing this than me. But, you know, my own view of that, just to briefly touch on it, is I think that those licenses should never expire. And then there's going to be the issues of, well, because I think the license should be tied to a particular game only, and that's it. But anyway, that's it for this. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more to come.